The weight of a raised hand. I remember the exact moment my life ended. Not the moment I died, mind you, because I did not die, and that is the cruelest part of everything that followed. I remember the exact moment my life as I had known it, with all its small indignities and modest comforts, and the particular smell of my wife's sailor's hair when she leaned against my shoulder in the evening, ceased to exist as a continuous thing, and became instead a before. Everything after was something else. Something I do not have a clean word for, even now, even with the distance of whatever time has passed since I was last allowed to think freely. But I will try to tell it. I will try to tell it plainly, because I think plain telling is what it deserves, and because I no longer have enough pride left to dress it in anything finer. My name was Drevin Holt. I say was not because I am dead, but because the Imperium of man, in its boundless administrative wisdom, has a category for people like me, and in that category, the name you were born with is a detail rather than an identity. I held that name for 32 years on the hive world of Scintilla, in a mid-hive district called Sump's Reach, which was neither as grim as the underhive it pressed against from above, nor as luminous as the spire districts that floated somewhere over our heads like a dream told to someone else's children. We were between. We were always between. That was the defining quality of Sump's Reach, and perhaps of everyone in it. We were the people who existed in the middle distance of the Imperium's attention, neither important enough to be celebrated, nor desperate enough to be a problem. I was a shift foreman at Rechnov Prometheum Processing Station 17, which most people in the district simply called the burn, because the air around it smelled of it, and because the work had a way of consuming people slowly, rather than quickly, which was almost considered preferable. I managed 12 workers across a 10-hour shift cycle. I signed their forms, approved their rest breaks, filed their incident reports, and made sure the Prometheum throughput numbers reached the daily quota that kept the station's tithe allocation in the acceptable range. I was not good at the work because I loved it. I was good at it because I had been doing it for 9 years, and I had learned that consistency was its own kind of armor. If the numbers were acceptable, no one looked at you, and in Sump's Reach, being looked at was rarely a gift. Nothing was as it seemed that morning. I had arrived 12 minutes early for my shift, which was normal for me. The station was already alive with the low mechanical grinding of the processing drums and the sullen flicker of the overhead lumen strips, 3 of which had been cycling through a brownout pattern for 6 weeks without the maintenance requisition being approved. The air tasted of promethium and iron and the particular kind of chemical sweat that accumulates in enclosed industrial spaces. I knew that taste. I had stopped noticing it years ago the way you stop noticing the ambient sound of your own blood moving. It was simply the air. It was simply where I was. My crew arrived in the way shift workers always arrive. Not quite awake, not quite present, bodies moving through the routines their muscles had memorized, so their minds did not need to be entirely operational. Ferran Vash, my pressure valve operator, came in rubbing condensation off his visor. Josiah Mel, who managed the coolant distribution lines, had a thermal bulb of recaf balanced in the crook of her elbow. The others settled into their positions with the same comfortable listlessness they always brought to the first hour, and I moved through the pre-flight check the same way I had moved through it for 9 years, touching panels, reading gauges, initialing the log with my foreman's stamp. The morning was ordinary. I cannot stress that enough. The morning was so completely ordinary that the part of my mind that was always braced for something to go wrong had already relaxed before the first hour was finished. That is the thing about disaster in a Prometheum station. You spend so much time anticipating the dramatic failures, the catastrophic ones, the rupture in the main line or the ignition cascade, that the quiet failures surprise you more. Pressure valve 7 began showing an anomalous reading at approximately the 2nd hour of the shift. At first it was just a number slightly outside the normal tolerance band, the kind of variance that happens a dozen times a shift and usually corrects itself within a few minutes as the system finds its equilibrium. I noted it in the log and told Ferran to keep an eye on it. He nodded without particular concern. I moved on to review the coolant flow report that Josiah had left on my terminal. The numbers were fine. Everything was fine. Then the sound began. It was a high, mechanical whine, the kind that comes from a pressure seal beginning to fatigue under load. I knew that sound. Every foreman who had worked the burn for more than a year knew that sound, the way a parent knows the particular pitch of their child crying before they have fully processed that they are awake. I was already moving before I had consciously decided to move, crossing the grated floor with purpose, the metal ringing under my boots in that hollow way it always did, above the lower drum chambers. Ferren was at the valve assembly with his diagnostic tool already in hand, his face behind the visor showing the tense concentration of a man who knows something is wrong and has not yet quantified how wrong. The whine was louder here. I could feel it in my back teeth. The pressure gauge above the valve was climbing past the red marker on the dial face, and the dial face was old enough that the paint around the red marker was faded, which somehow made it more frightening rather than less, because it meant the dial had seen that number reached before, and had survived to show it again without anyone fixing the underlying problem. "Cut the feed line," I told Ferren. "Already tried," he said, and there was something in his voice that I recognized as the exact border between professional calm and genuine fear. "Manual override isn't responding. Solenoid seized." The whine became a shriek. There is a specific physics to pressure failure in a Prometheum processing line that I had been trained on, that I had read about in incident reports, that I had, in 9 years, never personally witnessed at close range. The seal fails, the valve blows, and the pressurized Prometheum contents of that section of pipe exit with tremendous force, and because Prometheum is what it is, the temperature differential between the pressurized contents and the surrounding air is enough to begin the ignition process before the material has even fully cleared the rupture point. I knew all of that. I knew exactly what was about to happen, and I knew that Ferren and I were standing close enough to it that the outcome was not something I wanted to think about with any clarity. I raised my hand. I do not know why I raised my hand. It was not a conscious decision in any way that I can faithfully describe. It was the same kind of movement you make when you flinch away from something coming at your face, except it was directed at the valve, at the failing seal, at the climbing pressure reading, as if I believed in some deep animal part of myself that the gesture would accomplish something, and I heard myself make a sound, not a word, not a cry, something beneath language, something that came from a part of me I had not previously been aware of having, and it left my throat like something being torn free rather than produced. The valve went silent. Not the silence of a system shutting down, not the silence of a seal holding, the silence of something arrested mid-motion, like a wave frozen at the precise moment before it breaks. The pressure gauge dropped, not gradually, not in the oscillating way of a system finding equilibrium, but instantly and completely, from deep in the red to a reading so far below normal that for a moment I thought the gauge itself had broken. The whine was gone, the shriek was gone, there was only the ambient sound of the station around us, the grinding of the processing drums, the hiss of functioning lines, and Ferren Vash's breathing, which had become very loud and very deliberate. He was staring at me. Not at the valve. At me. I lowered my hand. I did not know when I had raised it fully, but it had been above my shoulder, fingers spread, palm facing the valve assembly, and the angle of it was not the angle of someone bracing for impact. It was the angle of someone commanding something to stop. I lowered it, and I felt the cold settle in my chest, the way it settles when you understand that something has happened that you cannot immediately explain. "Feed must have dropped upstream," I said. My voice was steady. I was very proud of how steady my voice was. Ferren said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the pressure gauge. He looked at me. He looked at the valve assembly, which was pristine and intact, and showed no evidence of the failure that had, by any engineering logic I could apply, been seconds away from being catastrophic. Then he said, "Right," in the voice of someone agreeing to a statement they do not believe, in order to avoid the consequences of disagreeing with it. I filed the incident report as a transient pressure anomaly, upstream feed variance, no component failure, no personnel risk actualized. I used careful, correct language. I used the kind of language that closes a report rather than opens an investigation. I stamped it with my foreman's seal and submitted it to the station's automated processing queue, and I walked back to my terminal, and I sat down, and I placed my hands flat on the surface of the desk, and I looked at my hands for a very long time. The truth arrived quietly. The rest of that shift I carried out with the methodical precision of a man performing a ritual he no longer believes in, but has not yet found the courage to abandon. I checked gauges. I approved rest rotations. I initialed 3 routine maintenance requests and denied one that lacked the proper secondary authorization signature. I spoke to each of my crew members in turn, in the normal way, with the normal words, and they spoke to me in return, and I noticed that Ferren did not speak to me at all after the valve incident, and I told myself that was nothing. Ferren was often quiet. Ferren was a man who processed things internally. This was not significant. I went home. Sailor was cooking when I came through the door of our HAB unit, standing at the small burner block with her back to me, stirring something in the deep pot that meant she had found reasonably priced protein cuts at the block market. The smell of it was good. The HAB was warm. There were 2 small lumen globes over the eating table casting the particular amber light that we had always described as the unit's best feature, which tells you something about the unit. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than I usually did, just looking at it, before I spoke her name. She turned and smiled and asked about the shift, and I told her it was normal. Fine. A pressure anomaly, upstream variance, nothing that came to anything. She nodded the way she always nodded when I described work things, attentive enough to be kind but not particularly invested, because the specifics of Prometheum processing were not her passion any more than the specifics of her administrative transcription work at the district prefect's office were mine. We had a marriage built on comfortable parallel expertise. We understood each other without always understanding what the other was expert in. I ate dinner. I washed. I sat with Scylla on the edge of the sleep platform while she read from her data slate, a novel of some kind, one of the approved serials that circulated through the Hive District's lending archives, and I stared at the wall opposite and tried to think about what had happened. I had been under chronic mild stress for years, the accumulated residue of managing people and quotas and equipment that was always slightly more worn than the maintenance budget could properly address. I had been breathing Prometheum-adjacent air for 9 years. There were well-documented neurological effects of long-term chemical exposure in processing environments. The incident could be explained. The incident was, in fact, already explained in the incident report I had filed, and incident reports in the Imperium of Man had the virtue of becoming official fact the moment they were submitted and processed. I said all of this to myself, internally, with great conviction. I believed almost none of it. There was something beneath the surface of the day that I could not name, something that had been there since the moment I had raised my hand and made that sound, something that felt less like a feeling than like a new organ that had been present all along and had simply begun, for the first time, to function. I was aware of the room differently than I usually was, not in a dramatic way, not in a way I could have described to Scylla without sounding like someone who had inhaled too much fume residue, but the room felt inhabited by more than just us. There was a texture to the air that was not temperature, a weight to the quiet that was not quite silence. I closed my eyes and pressed my fingers against them until I saw light. Sleep came slowly and badly, and when it came, it brought no dreams I could remember, only the residue of dreams, the emotional sediment of them, which was somehow worse. I woke before the shift alarm, which was not unusual for me, and lay in the dark listening to Scylla breathe and watching the faint underlighting that leaked through the shuttered ventilation grate above the sleep platform. Scintilla's upper hive threw light down through the strata in diffuse, diluted ways, and even in Sump's reach in the middle of the standard night cycle, there was never complete darkness. There was always something filtering through. I had always found that comforting. That morning, I found it difficult to look at. The lumen globe over the eating table, the smaller of the two, had shattered sometime in the night. I discovered this when I crossed the main room in the dark to reach the ablutions block, and my foot found a piece of it before I had turned on anything. I stood in the dark with the sharp edge of it pressing into the sole of my foot through the thin material of my night shoes, and I did not move for a breath that lasted too long. Then I turned on the secondary lamp from the wall panel and looked at the globe, which had not simply burned out the way globes burn out when their filament fails, with the glass intact and the light simply gone. It had shattered outward. The pieces were distributed across the table surface and the floor around it in a pattern that suggested the failure had come from within rather than from external impact. Globes do not shatter from within when their filaments fail. I cleaned up the pieces with a cloth and a collection tray and deposited them in the waste receptacle. I did this slowly and carefully. I made sure I got all the pieces. I made sure the table and floor showed no evidence of it when Sella came through in the morning, and when she asked at breakfast if the small globe had burned out, because she could see the absence of it from where she sat, I said yes, burned out. I had already submitted a replacement request through the block maintenance system. I had not submitted any such request. I went to work. The second day began the way the second day always begins after something has happened that you have decided to not fully acknowledge, which is to say with a performance of normalcy, so complete that the performance itself becomes evidence of guilt. I arrived at the station at the normal time. I performed the pre-flight check. I greeted my crew. I initialed the overnight maintenance log and noted that the approved repair on the brownout lumen strips in the south corridor had been scheduled for later in the shift cycle, which was satisfying in a mechanical way. Ferenvash was already at his station when I arrived. He had been there early, which was not unusual for him, but the quality of his presence was different. He was doing his job, filling in his gauge check form, calibrating his pressure monitor, doing every physical thing he always did, but he did not say good morning, and when I moved past him to check the valve assembly status, which I did as naturally as I could, he moved slightly away from me in the practiced, socially invisible way of someone who does not want to be observed making the movement. I noticed. He did not know I noticed. I was careful about that. The morning passed in segments that felt both longer and shorter than normal, which is the particular temporal distortion of waiting for something without knowing what you are waiting for. I attended to my duties. I approved a coolant flow adjustment that Josiah requested after her morning readings came in low. I reviewed the throughput projections for the next shift cycle and noted we were trending toward quota without any need for additional throughput acceleration, which was a small daily victory of the kind that constitutes a shift foreman's professional satisfaction. It was at the 4th hour mark, during the mid-shift rest rotation, that the second thing happened. The rest area adjacent to the processing floor was a narrow room with 3 benches, a water recycler that dispensed tepid liquid that approximated hydration without being particularly enjoyable, and a shelf where people stored their personal effects during shift. 6 of my 12 crew were in there on their rotation break. I had come in to initial the break register, which was a requirement that I had always considered pointlessly bureaucratic, but which I fulfilled anyway, because a form not initialed is an audit risk, and audit risk in a Prometheum station could mean anything from a fine to an investigation, depending on the mood of the district inspector. Bain Koreth was one of the 6 on break. He was a line worker, 20 years in the station, a man whose primary social expression was complaint, but a reliable complaint, consistent and predictable, focused almost entirely on the inadequacy of the rest area's water recycler and the unfairness of the shift rotation schedule. I had been managing his complaints for 9 years with the patient tolerance of someone who has learned that certain types of complaint are not actually requests for resolution, but are rather a form of social grooming, a ritual of grievance that costs nothing to receive and maintains a kind of working harmony by being acknowledged without action. He said something to one of the other workers on break, something about the shift schedule, the usual, and something in the room shifted, not physically, not in a way I could point to. But there was a change in the way the air in that room felt, a sudden pressure increase behind my eyes, and I heard, quite clearly, in a register that was not quite sound, the word worthless, and I knew with absolute certainty that the word was not part of any conversation happening in the room. It was what Bain Koreth was thinking. Not about the shift schedule, about me, about my response to his concerns over the previous years, about the valve incident the previous day, which I now realized he had heard about through the informal station gossip network before I had processed that he would have. The pressure behind my eyes spiked. A ceramic water cup sitting on the bench beside Bain Corrith exploded. Not dramatically, not with violence. It simply ceased to be a cup and became 5 large fragments and a spray of the tepid recycled water across the bench surface and Bain Corrith's left forearm. He made a startled sound and stood up. Everyone in the room looked at the cup. Then everyone looked at me, because I was standing in the doorway and I was the most recently arrived person in the room, and human instinct, when something inexplicable occurs, is to find the outlier and apply causation to proximity. I said, faulty construction, old manufacturing batch, file a procurement complaint, and I initialed the brake register and left. I walked directly to the ablutions block at the far end of the processing corridor, entered one of the private stalls, secured the door, and stood with my back against the wall with my hands pressed flat to the cold metal on either side of me, pressing my palms against it hard, feeling the vibration of the processing drums through the wall, as if I could let the machine rhythm replace whatever rhythm was building inside me. I was not a superstitious man. I had grown up in Sump's Reach under the authority of the Adeptus Ministerum's local congregation, attended the mandatory throne observances, recited the litanies in the communal manner expected of citizens in good standing, and believed in the God Emperor of mankind with the same comfortable, unchallenged certainty with which I believed in the processed air recyclers that kept the atmosphere of the hive breathable. It was foundational, it was simply there. I had never examined it closely, because it had never seemed to require examination. The God Emperor in his infinite wisdom, as articulated by the Ministerum in its official communications, protected humanity from the predations of the warp, from the lies of the ruinous powers, from the corrupting influence of psychic activity that opened doors in the fabric of reality that could not be safely closed. The word witch had been part of my vocabulary since childhood, used with the particular casual horror reserved for things that are theoretically distant from your life, but nevertheless frightening to contemplate. Witches were in the hive ghost stories. Witches were in Arbeit's arrest records that occasionally appeared in the district news circulars. Witches were something that happened to someone else, to people without quota numbers and shift rosters and modest domestic lives. The silence grew heavier. I stayed in the ablutions stall for 6 minutes and 40 seconds, which I know because I counted the seconds. I counted them because I needed something concrete to do with my mind, while my mind was doing something I could not control, which was assembling evidence. My mind, without my permission, was assembling a clear and sequenced account of everything that had happened since the previous morning, and the account it was assembling did not have a version that ended in upstream pressure variance and faulty cup construction. I returned to the processing floor. I completed my shift. I went home. Sella was awake when I came through the door, sitting at the eating table with her data slate, which was unusual because she typically spent the early evening shift in the common room of the block's ground floor, where a group of women from the surrounding units gathered to exchange whatever social information constituted the informal governance of Sump's Reach residential life. She looked up when I came in, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been waiting for something they were not sure they should be waiting for. Ferren Vash came by, she said. I put my bag down. I took off my outer coat. I hung it on the hook by the door where it had hung every evening for 9 years. What for? I said. He wanted to see if you were well, she said. He said there was an incident yesterday, at the station. She paused. Her pause had a quality to it. He said he wanted to check on you. That was thoughtful of him, I said. I moved to the recycler and drew a cup of water, which I drank without tasting. Drevin, she said. I turned around. Her face, in the amber light of the single remaining lumen globe, was careful. It was the face of someone choosing their words with precision, which was not a face I associated with Sailor in our private space. With me, she was not usually precise. With me, she was the version of herself that did not need to be precise. The careful face meant something. "He didn't only come to check on you," she said. I said, "Tell me what he said." She looked at her hands on the table, then she looked at me. "He said the pressure gauge dropped to 0. He said it dropped the instant you raised your hand. He said he's worked pressure systems for 20 years, and he's never seen a gauge drop like that, from a red zone reading to 0, without the feed cutting first." She stopped. She started again. "He said the valve would have blown. He said it would have blown right into the two of you, and then it didn't." I sat down across from her. "And he wanted to know," she said, and her voice was very steady, the kind of steady that takes effort. "If anything else had happened today. He said he heard one of the rest area cups broke. He said Bane Korath is saying things." "What kind of things?" I said. She looked at me for a long time without speaking. "Sella," I said. "The kind of things," she said quietly, "that get someone looked at." We sat with that for a long moment. The single lumen globe above us hummed at its usual frequency, and I was intensely conscious of it, of the fact that it was humming, of the fact that it was intact, of the fact that I was aware of its intactness in a way that was not normal awareness. I said, it was upstream pressure variance, and the cup was old manufacturing. She said, "Drevin." I said, "It was." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and I felt the warmth of it, and I also felt something else, something that I will try to describe as accurately as I can, even though the description will sound wrong. I felt her, not just her hand, some quality of her presence that was information the way temperature is information, a reading of something real that exists independently of the thermometer used to measure it. I felt her fear, not inferred from her expression, not deduced from the careful face. Felt it, directly, in the way you feel your own heartbeat when you've been running, as an immediate physical fact. I removed my hand from under hers. "I'm tired," I said. "Long shift, I'm going to sleep." She said nothing. I went into the sleep room and lay down on the platform and stared at the ceiling for a long time, and sometime in the middle of it I began to cry, which I did not permit myself to do loudly, and which I was finished with before Selah came to bed, so that when she lay down beside me, and the warmth of her pressed against my back in the habitual way of 9 years of shared sleep, I was already still. Nothing was as it seemed. The third day began before dawn, which was to say before the upper hive's light filtration systems reached the intensity that qualified as Scintilla's morning. I was awake at the 4-hour mark, and I was awake because the voices woke me. Not voices from outside the hab, not the sounds of neighbors through the shared partition walls, which I knew as thoroughly as I knew my own breathing, the particular rhythm of old Mevra in the unit to the left, who spent her nights in the coughing fits of someone whose respiratory system had been compromised by decades of recycled hive air, or the low thrum of the Torsten family's entertainment system 2 units to the right, kept at the barely permissible volume they had maintained since the block supervisor had issued them a noise citation 18 months ago. I knew all of those. This was not those. This was inside, not inside the hab. Inside me. It was not speech in any conventional sense, not words arranged in sentences in any language I consciously recognized. It was more like the impression of meaning without the medium, the way you can understand what someone is communicating through their expression before they have spoken a word. There was a texture to it that felt very old, older than the hive, older than the planet, though I recognized immediately that this was not a thought I should be having, because the quality of ancientness I was applying to interior voices was precisely the quality that the Ministorum warned against in its formal communications regarding warp-influenced psychological intrusion. I knew the vocabulary. I had heard it in service observances. I had let it pass through me the way you let institutional language pass through you when it applies to someone else. It was applying to me now. The voices were not demonic. I want to be clear about that, because I think when people imagine this, when they imagine a person in the Imperium beginning to hear voices, they imagine something cinematic, something with malice and invitation, and the obvious quality of corruption. This was nothing like that. It was ambient. It was like the background radiation of a city heard through a sealed window, the aggregate of many presences processed at a distance into something that resembled a single continuous murmur. I could not make out specific content, but it was there, and it was getting louder. I got up without waking Sailor, and went into the main room and stood in the dark, and breathed in a measured way for approximately 10 minutes. The voices did not stop. They changed in quality when I breathed slowly, becoming slightly less textured, slightly more distant, the way you can reduce the perceived volume of external sound by filling your own head with the sound of your breath, but they did not go away. I went to the small storage alcove beside the entrance and removed from the shelf the copy of the Imperial Creed primer that we kept there in the fashion of all households in Sump's Reach, not from any particularly fervent personal devotion, but because it was the kind of thing you kept, the way you kept your citizen registration documents and your household ration allocation card. I held it. I did not open it. I held it, and I thought about the Emperor of Mankind in the way I had been taught to think about him, as a presence of immense and protective power, as a figure whose light extended from the golden throne across the galaxy in some form that was functionally metaphorical, but also, the Ministorum insisted, literally real. I thought about his light, and I thought about where I was currently standing in relation to it. I put the primer back on the shelf. I made recaf, the packet kind that dissolved in hot recycled water, and I sat at the table and I drank it in the quiet, and the voices moved through me like something I was beginning, against everything I valued about myself, to understand. I went to work. The walk to the station was 20 minutes through the block's transit corridor, which ran along the outer skin of the residential cluster and opened into the wider industrial access ways of the district at the junction that everyone called the mouth because of the way the ventilation shaft above it exhaled warm processed air year-round. I walked that route every morning. I knew the people I passed on it, not by name in most cases, but by face and schedule. The woman with the green head covering who worked the early food service shift, the pair of older men who always seemed to be having the same conversation in slightly different words, the young cycle courier who navigated the corridor at speeds that were technically prohibited, but that no one had ever successfully cited him for. This morning as I passed them I heard things. Not the voices from the night. Something different. Something that corresponded to them in space and proximity. Something that shifted as I moved past each person. A flutter of emotional content. That I received the way you receive warmth from a passing heat source. Directional and specific. The woman in the green head covering was anxious about something involving her daughter. The two older men were both, beneath the conversational ritual, profoundly lonely. The courier was thinking about food in the detailed, specific way of someone who has not had enough of it recently. I was reading them. I did not want to be reading them. I pressed my focus forward, onto the route, onto the approaching station access, onto the quota numbers, and the maintenance schedule, and the approved requisition forms I would need to review at shift start. I built a wall of concrete operational thought, and I walked behind it for the remainder of the transit. At the station, the wall held for most of the morning. It did not hold at the 7th hour. The 7th hour was when one of my junior crew members, a young woman named Tessa Pont, who had been with the station for 8 months and who showed every indication of becoming a solid long-term worker, came to me at my station terminal with her weekly performance review form for me to initial and file. She stood before me in the way that junior workers stand before foremen when they are uncertain of their standing, slightly too straight, the document held at a slightly formal angle. I looked at the form. The numbers were fine. I reached for my stamp, and I felt from her, clearly and completely, a feeling that I can only describe as terror. Not of me specifically, or not only of me, of something she had overheard. I understood, in the way I was now understanding things without wanting to, that she had heard Bain Corrith speaking about the cup incident to at least 2 other crew members, and that Bain Corrith had used the word witch in the informal, colloquial, but unmistakable way of someone who has moved past implication into accusation. And Tessa Pont, who was 23 years old and who had grown up in a lower hive district far more intimate with the Arbeits enforcement protocols than Sump's Reach, understood exactly what that word meant, and exactly what happened to people it was attached to, and exactly what happened to people who were known to be associated with someone it was attached to. She was afraid of what would happen to her job, to her clearance status, to her presence in the station's employment record if my name became a problem. I stamped the form without reading it further and handed it back to her and said, "Good numbers this week, Pont." I said it with the professional warmth I had always used with junior staff. She took the form and left the terminal station faster than she needed to. I sat at my terminal, and I did not move for several minutes. The weight of the 7th hour settled into something I had been refusing to name since the previous morning. The refusing was finished now. I could not maintain the upstream pressure variance explanation against this accumulated weight of evidence. I was a man who worked with systems and with numbers and with the concrete logic of cause and effect in industrial processes, and the accumulated evidence of the past 36 hours had a conclusion, and the conclusion was not one I could continue to not have. I was a psyker. I did not know what kind. I did not know the classification, the grade, the specific nature of whatever aperture had opened in me, or whether it had been opening slowly for years, and had only now reached the threshold of visible consequence. I did not know anything about the technical or theological specifics of what I was. What I knew, from the same institutional knowledge that every imperial citizen accumulates from childhood simply by existing inside the Imperium of man, was what I was meant for my future. The black ships came to Scintilla on a regular cycle. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica maintained a collection schedule that the Ministorum incorporated into its sermons as a reminder of the Emperor's grace and the necessity of sacrifice. Those who were taken did not return. They were processed. Some became astropaths, psychically bound to the Emperor's will and blinded by the experience, essential to the communication networks that held the Imperium together across impossible distances. Some became sanctioned psychers, attached to military formations and burned down in the course of that service in ways that varied in their dignity. Most became fuel. The Golden Throne was a machine, and machines required power, and the power it required was measured in psyker souls. None of these futures had ever felt real to me, because none of them had ever been relevant to me. The truth arrived quietly, and this time it stayed. I finished my shift. I filed my reports. I said goodnight to my crew in the normal way, to those of them who would meet my eyes, and I walked home through the transit corridor, and this time I did not try to wall off what I was receiving from the people I passed. I let it move through me, not because I wanted to, but because I was too tired to resist it, and what I found was that it was not the demonic intrusion the Ministorum described. It was more like grief. It was like suddenly being able to hear everyone's grief at once, the accumulated low-frequency sorrow of people managing difficult lives with the resources available to them, and it was simultaneously unbearable and so deeply recognizable that I was not surprised by any of it. That recognition felt like the worst part. Sella was waiting at the table again. This time there were 2 cups of recaf on the table rather than 1, which meant she had heard me coming long before I opened the door, which meant she had been waiting in a specific way. I sat across from her. I put my hands on the table and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a moment that was long enough to become its own kind of statement. Then she said, "3 people in the block have asked me about the station incident." 3, I said. "Mevra, Liz from the 4th floor, and Hadrick from the end of our corridor." She wrapped both hands around her cup. Hadrick was the most specific about what he'd heard. Hadrick. I knew Hadrick by sight and by the occasional brief exchange in the corridor, the kind of interaction that constitutes neighborhood familiarity without constituting anything like friendship. He was a man in his late 50s who had retired from some kind of low-level administrative position in the district procurement office and who spent considerable energy on what he described as proper block maintenance, which in practice meant monitoring the conduct of other residents and filing formal complaints with the block supervisor when he believed standards were being breached. He had filed 6 noise citation reports against the Torstens. He had filed a sanitation complaint against the family on the 3rd floor whose waste collection was scheduled for a different day than ours. He was the kind of man who believed, genuinely believed, that the health of a community depended on the consistent application of proper procedure. I said, "What did he say?" "He asked me whether you had ever been assessed," she said. He used that word specifically. Assessed. Assessment was the formal euphemism used in Ministerum communications and in the public-facing Arbeiters documentation around the Astra Telepathica's collection activities. Citizens who displayed behaviors consistent with unauthorized psychic activity could be referred for assessment. The assessment process was administered at the district Arbeiters station, where a representative of the Scholastica Psychana would evaluate the individual in question. The outcome of an evaluation that returned a positive result was immediate and irreversible. "What did you tell him?" I said. "I told him you had not," she said. "I told him you had worked in the same station for 9 years without incident." Her voice was careful again, the precision voice. He said that records could be incomplete. I picked up the recaf cup. I drank. It was too hot and it burned the inside of my mouth slightly, and the small, sharp pain of it was, paradoxically, a relief, because it was a sensation that had a clear and ordinary cause. "Sella," I said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at me with the face of a woman who has been married to someone for 9 years and who has spent the last 36 hours quietly, methodically, destroying the version of herself that might react to this with emotion rather than with the calculated survival logic that the Imperium rewards in difficult situations. She looked at me with the face of someone who has already grieved the thing they are about to be told. She said, "Tell me anyway." So I told her, not everything, not the voices, not the reading of people's emotions in the transit corridor, but the valve incident, the cup, what I had felt in those moments, the thing I had been refusing to name, and I told it plainly, without decoration, in the voice I used for incident reports, because that was the voice I trusted to be accurate when accuracy was what was required. I told her what I thought I was. I told her I did not know how long it had been building, or why it had surfaced now. I told her I didn't know what to do. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat for a long moment with her hands around the cup, and then she said, in a voice I had never heard from her before, a voice that was both entirely calm and entirely desolate, "What does this mean for you?" "Not for us, for you." The distinction registered with me. I did not say anything about it. I said, "I don't know." She said, "They'll come." "I know," I said. She said, "How long do we have?" "I don't know," I said. "If Hadrick files a formal referral tonight, and I think he will, because that is the kind of man he is, then the Arbeits will receive it and process it in their normal queue. The queue for this kind of referral in a mid-hive district is typically 4 to 7 standard days before an assessor is dispatched. I had not known I knew this until I said it, which was unsettling in a way I could not fully account for. "Maybe less, depends on the current assessment caseload," she said, "so a few days." "Possibly," I said. She nodded. She stood up, and she picked up both cups, and she took them to the cleaning station, and she washed them, methodically, with the same care she brought to everything domestic, and she put them in the drying rack, and then she turned around and looked at me from across the room, and I saw on her face the last version of the expression I had always thought of as hers, the sailor expression, the one built from 9 years of knowing each other well enough to be honest, and I watched it transform into something else, something that was not cruel and was not even cold, but was necessary and final in the way of walls being built. "I can't go with you," she said. "If they come, I can't go with you, and I can't be seen to have known." "I know," I said. "It's not," she started, then she stopped, then she said, "It's not that I don't." "I know," I said. She went to bed. I sat at the table in the amber light of the single lumen globe, and I did not sleep, and the globe held itself together through the night, and I think some part of me was holding it together too, very carefully, because breaking things was no longer something I could afford to do in my own home. The silence grew heavier. I went to work on the third morning, because the alternative to going to work was staying in the hab, and I had decided, with the particular stubbornness of a man who has very few remaining decisions to make that feel like his own, that I would go to work. I would finish my shift. I would file my reports. I would do the things I had done for 9 years, because those things were mine, and the doing of them was the only form of agency I still believed I had access to. The station received me the way stations receive people who have become problems, which is to say with the same architecture and machinery and ambient chemical smell as always, but with the human layer of it rearranged. My crew was there. All 12 of them were there, and present, and doing their jobs. But the social fabric that makes a group of 12 people into a working crew, the informal communication, the small talk, the territorial jokes about other shifts, the collective performance of being a team, had thinned overnight into something barely functional. They were 12 individuals doing 12 individual jobs in the same space. The connective tissue was gone. Ferren was the most obvious about it. He had found a way to be perpetually just out of conversational range without it being overtly avoidant. He was always slightly turned, always slightly occupied, always technically justified in not being the person I was speaking to at any given moment. I watched this without addressing it, because addressing it would have required acknowledging the thing that was causing it, and I had made a decision to not perform that acknowledgement. Bain Corrith had called in unwell. I noted his absence in the log with a neutral notation and assigned his line duties to a secondary crew member and filed the temporary reassignment form with the correct authorization codes and went on with the shift. At the third hour, one of the overhead lumen fixtures in the south corridor, the ones whose repair had been finally scheduled for this shift cycle, flickered in a way that was slightly outside the normal brownout pattern. I felt it before I saw it, felt the electrical potential of it, the fatigue in the circuitry, felt it with the same new organ that had been awake since the previous morning, and I closed my eyes, and I felt myself very deliberately not doing anything about it. I felt the impulse, the instinctive reach toward the thing that was malfunctioning, and I held myself back from it with the same muscle one uses to keep oneself from flinching, and the lumen continued its brownout pattern, and eventually the maintenance crew arrived in the 5th hour and fixed it in the normal way with the correct tools and the correct procedure, and the repair was logged with the correct documentation, and that was the end of it. I was holding myself in. It was like breathing shallowly in a room that does not have enough air, technically sufficient, but creating a secondary problem of its own. At the 9th hour, near the end of the shift, I was at my terminal reviewing the day's throughput figures, when I felt a change in the quality of the station's emotional atmosphere, which I had been monitoring with the involuntary attention of someone who cannot turn off a sense they did not ask for. It was not a new emotion from my crew. It was something from outside the immediate processing floor, something from the direction of the station's administrative entrance, a quality that I can only describe as official interest directed toward a specific target. 20 minutes later, 2 members of the Adeptus Arbites in their dark carapace armor and the particular bearing of people who carry institutional authority as naturally as they carry their equipment, arrived at the processing floor and asked the administrative duty officer to indicate the location of the shift foreman. They were polite. That was the first thing I noticed. They were entirely, completely polite. They asked me to accompany them to the district station for what they described as a routine inquiry related to a citizen welfare assessment referral, and the language was so precisely calibrated, so completely devoid of accusation or aggression, that it had the quality of a form being filled in real time. I was not arrested. I was not charged. I was invited. The invitation had the same optional quality as the invitation to comply with the God Emperor's divine will, which is to say it was not optional, but it was phrased as if it were. I said, I need to file my end-of-shift report first. They said, of course. I filed my end-of-shift report. I filed it correctly and completely, with all the appropriate authorization stamps and notations, and I logged the temporary reassignment of Corrith's duties, and closed the performance review files I had been working through, and updated the quota tracking numbers for the day. I did all of this under the mild, patient observation of two Arbeits who stood approximately 3 meters away and said nothing. When I was finished, I stood and I put my foreman's stamp in the desk drawer, and I picked up my personal bag, and I walked with them out of the station. I did not look back at my crew. I thought about looking back. I decided that it would accomplish nothing except to give them the image of my face looking back at them from between two Arbeits, and that image would cost them something, the kind of social cost that comes from being associated in someone's memory with a difficult moment. I spared them that because it was the last professional courtesy I could offer. The Arbeits' transport was a sealed vehicle that smelled of metal and cleaning solvent, and the ride to the district station took approximately 25 minutes through access ways I had never used before. The Arbeits did not speak to me during the transport. They were not unkind. They were simply not engaged with me as a person, the way a transit system is not unkind to you, even though it does not know your name. The district Arbeits station occupied a severe block of processed ferrocrete in the administrative quarter of Sump's Reach, adjacent to the district prefect's office, which was where Sailor worked, which was a coincidence that I processed and then put aside, because there was nothing useful I could do with it. I was processed at the intake station, which involved a scan of my citizen registration mark, a biometric record, and the logging of my personal effects, which were bagged and tagged with a reference number in a way that suggested they expected to return them to me, and also suggested they were experienced enough with this particular type of intake to make no promises about when. They put me in a room. It was a small room with a table and 2 chairs and a ventilation grate and a lumen globe that functioned perfectly and that I was deeply careful not to look at too directly. The room was not a cell. It had the quality of an administrative waiting area more than a detention space. I sat in one of the chairs and I put my hands on the table and I waited. I was aware of the building around me in a way that was uncomfortable and expanding. The not quite sound of people in other rooms, other corridors, other levels of the building, not their conversations but their presences, the emotional data they were continuously generating, moved through me with the relentlessness of a tide. I could feel, from somewhere 2 floors above me, a man in a state of desperate fear that was fundamentally different from mine, sharper and more immediate, and I hoped for his sake that whatever he was afraid of resolved quickly, because the quality of his fear was genuinely difficult to be near. I focused on the table surface. It was standard administrative ferrocrete composite, lightly textured for grip, with the edge treatments of official Arbeits furnishing. I traced the edge with my finger and thought about the Prometheum station and the throughput numbers I had filed, and whether the evening shift foreman would find anything unusual in my handover documentation, and then I thought that these were not thoughts appropriate to the situation I was in, and then I thought that perhaps thinking about throughput numbers was exactly what a person should do when the situation they were in was one they were not going to be able to change. The door opened. The person who entered was not an Arbeits officer. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with the kind of face that has been composed into professional neutrality over such a long period that the neutrality has become structural rather than performed. She wore robes that were not ministorum robes but had a similar quality of institutional weight, dark grey with silver trim at the cuffs, and she carried a data slate and a small equipment case that she placed on the table without particular ceremony. Around her neck on a silver chain hung a symbol I recognized as the mark of the Scholastica Psyker, the academic and administrative arm of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. She sat across from me, and she looked at me with eyes that were neither unkind nor warm, that were simply professional, in the way of someone who has conducted this type of interview many hundreds of times. She said her name. I cannot reproduce it with complete accuracy, and I am not sure that it would serve any purpose to try. She said she was there to conduct an assessment interview in relation to the referral submitted by a citizen of my block, and that the purpose of the interview was to evaluate whether I required further evaluation by a senior assessor. She said this in a voice that was precise and unhurried, the way a medical professional describes a procedure, not to comfort but to inform, because informed compliance is procedurally simpler than uninformed resistance. She asked me if I understood. I said yes. She began the assessment. It was a series of questions, some of which were straightforwardly biographical: name, age, occupation, years of residence in the district, health history, and some of which were more specific, asking me to describe my subjective experience of particular types of situations, sensory or emotional anomalies I may have noticed, instances where the environment around me had responded to my internal states in ways that seemed inconsistent with normal physics. She asked the questions without inflection or suggestive emphasis, in a completely neutral register that gave nothing away about what any answer meant to her. I told her the truth. I do not fully understand why I told her the truth. It was not heroism. It was not some form of self-destructive honesty. It was, I think, the simple exhaustion of a man who has been telling lies in various directions for 72 hours, and who has no remaining reserves for continued performance. I told her about the valve incident. I told her about the cup. I told her about the lumen globe at home. I told her about the voices and the emotional perception in the corridor and at the station. I told her everything, in the same incident report voice I had used with Sella, with the same flat accuracy I applied to operational documentation. She recorded everything on her data slate. She asked clarifying questions occasionally, always precise, always limited to what had been directly relevant to what I had just said. When I finished, she reviewed her notes in silence for approximately 2 minutes. Then she looked at me across the table. She said, "Thank you, Dreven Holt. This is a thorough and coherent account." I said, "What happens now?" She said, "A senior assessor will review the record I have made today. In most cases of the type you have described, the review results in a secondary evaluation by a member of the Scholastica Psychana's field assessment team. This evaluation will be more comprehensive. Following that evaluation, a determination will be made regarding the appropriate pathway for your case." I said, "What does appropriate pathway mean?" She said, "It depends on the evaluation results. The possible outcomes are several." She did not enumerate them in the way I wanted her to enumerate them. She moved on. "During the period between this assessment and the completion of the secondary evaluation, you will be retained in supervised residential accommodations at this facility. Your employment status will be placed in administrative suspension. Your family will be notified through official channels." I said, "Can I contact my wife myself?" She looked at me. Her expression did not change. "A notification will be sent through official channels," she repeated. And then, in a slightly different register, in the precise way of someone departing from a script to make a small human acknowledgement, she said, "It will be received promptly." She stood, collected her data slate and case, and left the room. The silence grew heavier. I sat in the room for a long time after she left. A different Arbeitsofficer, younger, with the carefully maintained expression of someone new enough to institutional proximity with difficult situations that the expression still required effort, came in after approximately an hour to bring me a meal packet and a cup of water, and to tell me that the supervised residential accommodations were ready for me. I followed him through 2 corridors and a security checkpoint, and into a small room with a sleep platform, a hygiene unit, a ventilation grate, and a lumen globe. The globe was newer than the ones in my hab, and cast a cooler, bluer light. I lay down on the platform and I looked at the ceiling, and I let the building move through me, the aggregate of presences, the accumulated emotional texture of an arbite station at night, which was complicated and layered and occasionally very bleak, and somewhere in the middle of it, in the depth of the second night of what was about to be the rest of my life, I felt something change. Not inside me, something from outside, a presence I had not felt before, something much further away than the building, something that was not local in any of the ways the other presences were local. It was vast and strange and not anything I have a word for, and it registered in me the way a source of extraordinary heat registers even when you cannot see it, as pressure and warning and something beneath both, something that I can only describe as attention. Something had, for a brief and disorienting moment, noticed me. I knew, in the way I was now knowing things I could not account for, that this was significant. I knew it was related to what I was, and to the fact that I was now in the process of being recognized and catalogued by the Imperium's administrative machinery, and that recognition had a weight of its own in whatever medium the thing that had noticed me was perceiving through. I did not know what it meant. I was not equipped to know what it meant. I closed my eyes and pressed my face into the sleep platform's covering, and I held very still until whatever it was receded. The secondary evaluation took place 2 days after the initial assessment. In the time between, I existed in the supervised residential room with the blue light globe and 3 meal packets per day and a data slate that was preloaded with approved reading material, mostly ministorum texts, and a selection of approved historical accounts that I recognized as the standard educational material distributed in hive schools. I read none of them. I sat and I was present in the room, and I managed myself. Managing myself meant holding the incoming emotional and perceptive data at a distance, maintaining what felt like a controlled pressure differential between what was flowing through me and what I was allowing myself to process. It was exhausting in a specific way, the exhaustion of sustained attention rather than of movement, and by the end of each day I was hollow with it, but I held it. I held it because losing control of it in an RBT station felt like the most dangerous possible outcome of any available choice. The RBT's officer who brought my meals was the same young one. On the second day he sat briefly while I ate, which was not his assignment and which he clearly felt slightly conflicted about, and he said, in the careful way of someone doing something small and kind that is technically outside the protocol, that the assessor had noted my cooperation in her report, and that cooperation was considered relevant. He did not say to what it was relevant. He seemed to feel that saying this much had been enough. I said, "Thank you." He said, "It's not," and then stopped and started again. I mean, yes, of course. He stood and left, and came back for the empty tray in the normal way, and did not sit again. On the third day they moved me to a different room for the secondary evaluation, larger, with a table that could seat 6, and 2 lumen globes, and a window that looked into a ventilated corridor rather than outside, which I understood was a security feature. The secondary evaluator was a man, older than the woman who had conducted the first assessment, with the particular quality of stillness that comes from long practice in environments where stillness is a professional requirement. He wore the same institutional robes, same Scholastica Psyker mark. He also wore a hood of light psychoactive dampening material, the kind I had seen described in district safety communications without ever expecting to see in person, which was used as a precautionary measure around uncontrolled psychers to reduce feedback and intrusive perception. The fact of the hood told me something concrete about how I was classified, even before the evaluation began. He conducted the evaluation over 4 hours. Some of it was verbal, the same biographical and experiential questions as the initial assessment, but more detailed and probing. Some of it was not verbal. He had instruments in the equipment case he brought, calibrated tools of the Scholastica Psyker that I did not recognize and that I understood were measuring things about me in registers I could not observe. At one point he asked me to focus on a specific point on the wall and to be as still as possible while he measured something, and I felt his instrumentation touching the edges of whatever I had, not invasively but precisely, the way a medical scanner moves over a damaged area to map its extent. At the end of the 4 hours he reviewed his instruments and his notes, and he said, with the same careful professional neutrality as everyone who had spoken to me in this facility, "You have a measurable psychic potential, Drevin Holt. The grade is preliminary, as always, but the indicators are consistent with an individual who has experienced a spontaneous emergence following a period of prolonged stress. The type of expression you describe, telekinetic impulses, empathic perception, somnambulant psychic activity during sleep, is consistent with a class of psyker that is considered manageable from a containment perspective." Manageable. The word sat in the room with a weight that I do not think he intended it to carry. He continued, "Your case will be forwarded to the collection processing office of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica with my assessment report. You will remain in supervised accommodation pending their administrative processing." He paused. The collection schedule for this sector of Scintilla is approximately 4 standard weeks from this date. You will be transported from this facility to the collection processing center at that time. I said, the black ships. He said, collection transport, yes. I said, what happens to people like me? What actually happens? He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, with the careful honesty of someone who has decided to give a person the only thing they can still give them, which is a version of the truth. It depends on the grade and the type. Most individuals with your preliminary classification are evaluated extensively aboard the transport. Some are assigned to active service roles, some are assigned to the Astronomicon, some undergo the soul binding. He paused again. The process is not designed to cause unnecessary suffering. Not designed to. The qualifier was doing a great deal of work. I said, can I contact my wife? He said, the official notification has been sent. Personal contact is not permitted during the assessment and processing period. This is protocol. He looked at me. I'm sorry, he said, and I believe he meant it, in whatever attenuated way a person who says that sentence many times in a professional context can still mean it. I went back to my room. Over the next 4 weeks, things happened in measured, documented increments. I was permitted limited walking exercise in a supervised section of the facility's interior courtyard, a space enclosed by ferrocrete walls and covered by a security lattice, where 3 times a day I could move in the open air for 30 minutes, while an arbitres officer observed from an elevated position. The air in the courtyard smelled different from the processing station air, less chemical, more of simple dust and processed oxygen, and I found the 30 minutes each day the closest thing to peace I was capable of in that period. My abilities, for lack of a better word, continued to develop whether I invited them to or not. The voices from the night of my first awakening had become more constant, still ambient rather than specific, still not yielding clear content, but more textured, more present, more difficult to hold at the measured distance I was maintaining. The empathic perception had stabilized into something more like background input rather than sudden acute episodes, which I understood was either because I was learning to manage it or because I was simply adapting to a new level of input, the way you eventually stop noticing the grinding of the processing drums. Once, in the 2nd week, I lost control briefly. I was in the courtyard during the morning exercise period, and the Arbeits officer on observation that day said something to a colleague in a low voice that I was not meant to hear, and I heard it anyway, heard the specific words, and the specific contempt in them, the casual institutional cruelty of people who discuss their charges in terms that deny those charges full personhood, and the pressure behind my eyes spiked without warning. The security lattice above the courtyard, a grid of overlapping energy filaments designed to prevent both escape and intrusion, pulsed once, irregularly, in a way that was not part of its normal operation cycle. The officer on observation was immediately alert, his hand on his weapon, his eyes on me, and I felt his attention sharpen into readiness, and I felt his fear beneath the readiness, the fear of proximity to an uncontrolled psychic event. I pressed my hands flat against my thighs. I breathed. I held the pressure. The lattice returned to its normal operation. The officer kept his hand on his weapon for the remainder of the exercise period, and the exercise periods were shortened by 10 minutes for the following 5 days, which I noted was punitive in practice, even if it was procedurally justified on safety grounds. I did not lose control again. In the 3rd week, I was visited by a ministorum priest. This visit was, as far as I could tell, standard procedure, rather than anything directed specifically at my situation, a routine pastoral service offered to individuals in assessment and processing status. The priest was young, earnest, and clearly uncomfortable. He recited the standard litanies regarding the emperor's protection and the necessity of purification and the grace available to those who submitted willingly to the Imperium's processes. His voice was careful. His discomfort was, I felt through the involuntary empathic input I was managing, primarily rooted in the fact that he found proximity to Psykers personally frightening and had been assigned this ministry against his preference. I listened to the litanies without interrupting, I said the responses in the correct places. I received the blessing with bowed head in the correct manner. When he asked me if I had any spiritual concerns, I said that I trusted in the God Emperor's will, which was both the prescribed response and, in a deeply complicated way, I was only beginning to understand, something I was actually starting to believe, not because the belief was comforting, but because the alternative, which was resistance, required a premise of autonomous selfhood that the previous 4 weeks had methodically dismantled. After he left, I sat with the thing I had said and I examined it from several angles. I had been, before all of this, a man without particular faith. I had performed the observances because they were performed, the way you observe the traffic routing rules in the transit corridors because ignoring them is more complicated than following them. But faith as a living thing, faith as a relationship with something real, had not been part of my experience. What I was discovering now, in the ruin of everything else I had understood myself to be, was something that had the shape of faith even if the content of it was complicated by the fact that the thing I was potentially in relationship with was the mechanism of my own destruction. The Emperor's will, they said it so many times, in every form, every notification, every pastoral recitation, the phrase appeared like a watermark in official correspondence, present everywhere, invisible until you held the document up to the light. And standing in the light of the past 4 weeks, holding everything up to it, I was finding the watermark everywhere. I was not at peace with this. I want to be clear about that. I was not at peace with any of it. But peace had stopped being the goal somewhere around the 3rd day, and what I was moving toward instead was something more structural and less emotional, a framework for continuing to exist within the shape of what was happening to me, because the alternative was a form of psychological disintegration that, I had decided with the bleak practicality of a shift foreman, was not worth the dignity it cost. Nothing was as it seemed, and I was slowly learning to see in the dark. In the 4th week, 2 things arrived. The first was a message from Seller, transmitted through official channels as permitted under the processing protocols for the period immediately preceding collection, a standard document of spousal notification regarding asset disposition and administrative separation. It was a legal form. She had filled it out correctly and completely, with her characteristic administrative precision, and it authorized the transfer of our shared HAB lease to her sole tenancy and the reassignment of my citizen registration benefits to my listed dependents, which was a field I had always left blank because we had no children and had agreed, in the wordless way of 2 people who want the same thing without discussing it, that we did not intend to, and so the benefits were redirected to a charitable dispensation account in the district food allocation system. At the bottom of the form, in the space labeled Additional Commentary, which was a 2-line field not typically used in these documents, she had written, "I hold you in the Emperor's light," which was the phrase from the standard marriage observance ceremony, the one spoken at the moment of the blessing. It was the only personal content in the entire document. It was the only thing she had said to me in 4 weeks that was not mediated through administrative language. I read it 7 times. Then I filed the document in the correct slot in the processing stack as required, and I went to the courtyard for my exercise period, and I stood in the middle of it with my face pointed toward the security lattice and the diffused light above it, and I held myself very carefully together. The second thing that arrived in the 4th week was the transport notification. It was a formal document produced by the Administrative Processing Office of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, bearing the dual seals of that institution and the Adeptus Arbeits District Authority, informing me that my collection processing had been completed and that transportation to the Regional Collection Center would occur on the following cycle. The document included my assigned reference number, a long string of numerals and letters that was my new administrative identity within the Telepathica's systems, and a brief notation about what to bring, which was nothing, because personal effects were not accommodated in collection transport. I read the reference number several times until I had memorized it. I do not know why I memorized it. It was not a name. It was not an identity. It was a cataloging designation, the kind attached to any institutional asset being transferred between facilities. But it was mine in the way that nothing else in my current situation was mine, and I held on to it with the grip of someone who has very little left to hold on to. The night before the transport, I did not sleep. I lay in the sleep room with the blue globe light above me, and I let the building move through me, without managing the distance. Let everything flow through at whatever volume it had, because the discipline of management was something I was releasing. I had maintained it for 4 weeks with the rigorous attention of a shift foreman, managing a process he was responsible for. I was no longer the shift foreman. I was no longer responsible for the process. I let it go. What came through was overwhelming in the way of any sense after long deprivation. The building, the district, Sump's reach above and around the facility, the aggregate human experience of it, the quiet grief of people managing difficult lives, the occasional brightness of moments of genuine joy or connection that flared up through the general hum, like the specific pinpoints of light, visible in a sky otherwise uniform with cloud. I felt the district. I felt Scintilla. I felt what might have been its neighbor worlds and might have been the echoes of the millions of people moving across all of them. I could not be certain of the scale, and I could not be certain of the medium. I felt something else. The same vast, strange, not local presence from before. Farther now. No, not farther. Different. More precise in its distance. The way a voice becomes more distinct, the better you learn to distinguish it from the ambient noise around it. Something old and immense and attending, and the attending was not malevolent and was not benevolent in any personal sense and was not anything I had words for yet, and for the first time in 4 weeks, feeling it did not frighten me. That, above everything else, is what I cannot fully explain. The morning arrived in the blue glow of the globe and the sound of the facility beginning its day cycle, and an Arbites officer came for me at the time the notification had specified, and I was ready because there was nothing to gather and nowhere else to be. We walked through the corridors to the facility's secure vehicle bay, where a transport was waiting alongside 2 others, and I was processed through a transfer checkpoint that matched my reference number against my biometric data and assigned me to a numbered position in the transport's interior seating. There were 14 other people in the transport. I did not know any of them. They ranged in visible age from someone who appeared to be in their late teens to a woman who was clearly older than me by a significant margin. They were dressed in the same plain processing garments I had been issued, and they sat with the particular stillness of people in the aftermath of prolonged institutional processing, each one contained within themselves in the careful, practiced way of people managing something too large and too personal to express in a shared public space. None of us spoke during the initial transport phase. We sat in our numbered positions and the vehicle moved through access ways I could not see from the interior, and I felt through the vehicle's walls the city around us changing as we moved, the industrial textures of Sump's reach giving way to the bureaucratic density of the outer administrative districts, and then to something broader and more open that I identified after a moment as one of Scintilla's major transit arteries, the wide vehicular corridors that connected the mid-hive districts to the surface access points. We were going up, not to the spire, to the transit hubs that connected the mid-hive to Scintilla's orbital infrastructure, the massive elevators and shuttle facilities that moved cargo and passengers between the surface and the void. The black ships did not land. They waited in orbit, and the people who were taken to them were taken in the ordinary way of anyone traveling to orbit, through the standard transit infrastructure, except that the section of the transit infrastructure we moved through was not accessible to ordinary citizens and was managed by personnel who wore the telepathicas mark and who looked at the 14 people in our transport with the professional, attentive non-expression of people who have processed many such transports and who have resolved whatever personal feelings they may have had about the work into something sustainable. At the shuttle facility, we were processed again. Reference numbers matched. Biometric confirmation. Assignment to a larger group of approximately 60 people who had been collected from various facilities across the Scintilla mid-hive and who were now assembled in a secure processing room that was, I noted with a distant professional appreciation, extremely well organized. The organization of it had the quality of long practice and refined procedure. the kind of operational efficiency that comes from running the same process many times and optimizing it over centuries. The woman beside me in the processing room was the older woman from my transport. She was sitting very straight, hands folded in her lap, looking at the middle distance with an expression I recognized, because I had been wearing it for 4 weeks, as the expression of someone who has processed everything available to be processed and has arrived at the other side of processing into something that is not quite acceptance and not quite resignation, but is something in between that does not have a common name. I said, quietly, "How long did they take to find you?" She looked at me. Her eyes were grey and clear and very tired. 3 days, she said. From the first incident to the transport notification. She paused. You. 72 hours from the first incident to the assessment, I said. Another 4 weeks to process. She nodded. They have become more efficient, she said. And there was something in the way she said it that was not quite bitterness and not quite admiration, and was genuinely difficult to categorize. I said, "Do you know what happens next?" She said, "I know some of it. My grandmother was taken." She looked at her hands. She lasted 20 years as a sanctioned military attachment. She survived the soul binding. She stopped. She was not the same person after. My grandmother had a particular quality of, I suppose you would say, lightness. After the binding she was effective and capable and entirely without that quality. I thought about this. I said, "But she survived." She said, "She survived." The shuttle call came through the facility's communication system in the standard way, a series of tones and a reference number sequence, and we were assembled by the facility staff and moved through the boarding corridor, and I was aware, walking through it, that I was walking away from scintilla in the permanent sense, that the Prometheum processing station and the HAB unit and the amber light of the lumen globe and the smell of sailor's hair were all behind me now, not just in the immediate sense of distance, but in the deeper sense of category, that they were things I had had, and that I was in the process of becoming someone who had had them, past tense, as a person holds a former name. The shuttle was functional and cold, and smelled of recycled air, and the specific kind of sterile that is the smell of serious institutional spaces that have been cleaned very thoroughly for a very long time. We were seated and secured in the standard restraint configuration, and the shuttle went through its launch cycle with the mechanical efficiency of a vehicle that makes this journey constantly, and I watched through the small observation panel beside my assigned seat as the surface of scintilla fell away below us. I had lived there for 32 years. I had never once been above the mid-hive. I had never seen it from outside. It was vast in a way that the interior of it could not communicate. From above, in the early stages of ascent before the cloud cover closed over it, it was a landscape of extraordinary layered complexity, the strata of human civilization pressed together over millennia into something that had its own geology, its own weather systems, its own internal light sources visible as a continuous amber glow through the cloud layer. Sump's Reach was somewhere in there, in the middle distance of that glowing mass, indistinguishable, lost in the aggregate. I looked at it until the cloud cover closed completely. Then I looked at the dark above. The black ship was visible as we approached it, which is to say, I could see it through the observation panel in the way you can see a cliff face in the dark, not from illumination, but from the absence of stars behind it. It was enormous in the particular way of things built without any consideration for how they appear from outside, built entirely for function, for the specific function of transporting large numbers of people across interstellar distances in contained and controlled conditions. It had the architecture of a machine that is also a building, that is also a statement of institutional purpose, all angular masses and void-facing arrays, and the running lights of its operational systems that blinked in their steady cycles with the indifferent patience of things that run on their own rhythms, regardless of who is watching. We docked through one of many docking ports on its lower hull, and the shuttle's pressure equalization process took approximately 12 minutes, and then we were moving again, through the dock into the ship's interior, through another processing checkpoint, another reference number matching, another biometric confirmation, another assignment, this one to a numbered compartment within what the facility staff described as the accommodations section of the vessel. The accommodations section was not punitive. I want to be accurate about this, because the accuracy of it is part of what I am trying to convey. The compartment I was assigned was small, but not smaller than the sleep room I had been in at the Arbeits facility. It had a sleep platform and a hygiene unit, and a ventilation grate, and a lumen globe. The globe cast the same blue light as the one at the facility, and I understood that the blue spectrum was likely a deliberate choice, something about the specific wavelength being less likely to trigger certain types of psychic response in individuals of my classification, which was the kind of detail that reflected the immense depth of institutional knowledge that had been accumulated around the management of people like me. I was brought a meal at the standard cycle. A staff member who was immortal with the telepathica's mark and the particular professional calm of everyone in this institution explained to me what I could expect in the initial transit period, when formal assessment and classification would begin, when I would have access to the common spaces of the accommodations section, when the ship would depart Scintilla's system. All of this was explained with great clarity and without any pretense that my preferences regarding any of it were a relevant factor. The ship departed Scintilla's system on the following cycle. I know this because I felt it, not in any mystical sense but in the mechanical sense of the vessel's engines reaching their transit threshold and the particular shift in the ambient vibration that comes from a ship transitioning between in-system drive and something more fundamental. The vibration changed in a way that moved through the floor of the compartment and through the sleep platform and into my bones, and simultaneously the not-quite sound of the voices I had been managing since the first morning shifted in a dramatic and disorienting way, becoming simultaneously louder and quieter, closer and more diffuse, as if the medium they moved through had changed. We had entered the warp. I had known, in the abstract institutional knowledge way, that the black ships traveled through the Imperium, that the warp was the medium of interstellar transit, that the ships were protected by their onboard Geller fields and by the concentration of sanctioned psychic might that the Telepathica maintained aboard its vessels for exactly this purpose. I had known all of this the way I knew that Scintilla's atmosphere was maintained by recycling systems I had never personally inspected. Knowing it and being inside it were different. The warp, as I experienced it from within a protected transit vessel, was not the demonic horror of the devotional literature. It was more like pressure, like being at the bottom of something very deep, where the weight of what was above you was constant and pervasive and did not crush you only because of the integrity of the vessel you were in. The voices changed here. The ambient, not quite sound I had been managing became richer and stranger and more difficult to hold at distance, and there were things moving in it that I could feel the shape of without being able to see them clearly, the way you feel the presence of large animals in dark water without being able to resolve them into identifiable form. I held myself very still in the compartment and I managed the distance, and I did not let anything come fully through. The formal assessment and classification process began on the third transit day. I was brought to a section of the ship I had not previously seen, a sequence of rooms that had a different quality from the accommodations section, more clinical, more equipped, the rooms of a process rather than a place for people to be. The assessors here were more senior than any I had met on Scintilla, older and more precise, and carrying about them the particular gravity of people who work at the intersection of knowledge and institutional power, who know exactly what they are doing and exactly why, and have long since resolved any personal conflict about either. They assessed me over 3 days, in sessions that were alternately verbal and instrumental, that probed what I was, in ways both direct and indirect, that took readings and recordings and ran evaluations that I did not fully understand and was not provided complete information about. I cooperated with all of it in the same way I had cooperated with everything since the first assessment on Scintilla, completely and without reservation, partly because I had decided that cooperation was the only remaining form of agency available to me, and partly because, deeper than that decision, I had arrived at something that I was still reluctant to call acceptance but that functioned like it. On the third assessment day, the lead assessor told me my preliminary classification. I was rated at a level that he described as low mid-range, not negligible, not exceptional, notable for the empathic component being more developed relative to the telekinetic component than was typical for my general profile, which he said was unusual, in a way that was professionally interesting to him, and which would be flagged in my record for consideration during assignment processing. Assignment processing. The phrase had a different weight on the ship than it had in the District Arbeits facility. Here it was concrete rather than euphemistic. Here it meant something specific was going to happen to me that would be determined by the content of the record that was now being built around my reference number, and the record was going to be complete and detailed and accurate in a way that personal records rarely are for ordinary citizens, because the Telepathica's investment in accuracy about what its collected individuals were capable of was a matter of institutional survival. I asked him if I could know what the possible assignments were for my classification and profile. He considered this for a moment, which was more consideration than any of the previous assessors had given to my questions before answering. Then he said, "Your telekinetic expression is present, but not strong enough for most combat-adjacent service roles. Your empathic component is strong. Individuals with strong empathic components are assessed for astropathic training, for intelligence-gathering service attachments, for certain roles in the Telepathica's own administrative and oversight functions." He paused. "The soul binding is not universal at your classification level. It is one possible path, not a certain one." I said, "What is the soul binding like?" He looked at me with the eyes of someone who has been asked this before and who has thought carefully about how to answer it. He said, "It is a communion with the Emperor's psychic presence of sufficient intensity to permanently mark and bind the individual's psychic expression to that presence. It provides protection against warp intrusion and against unauthorized psychic expression. It also causes blindness, uniformly, and it changes the individual in ways that are consistent across all who undergo it." He stopped. "Whether those changes are best understood as loss or transformation is a philosophical question I am not qualified to settle." I thought about the grey-eyed woman on the transport, her grandmother, the likeness that did not return. I said, "Thank you." He said, "We will inform you of the assignment determination when it is made." I went back to the accommodations compartment and I lay on the sleep platform and I was in the warp, surrounded by its pressure and its strange peripheral presences and the voices that moved through everything here at a higher volume than they had on Scintilla, and I thought about lightness. I thought about whether I had any lightness left to lose. The transit lasted, in ship time, approximately 3 weeks. Ship time in the warp is an unreliable measure relative to external time, and I had no way of knowing what 3 ship weeks corresponded to in terms of time passing elsewhere in the galaxy, on Scintilla, in Sump's Reach, in the HAB unit where Sela was now sole tenant under the lease transfer I had signed in the official form 4 weeks before departure. I thought about her regularly, not with the acute pain of the first days, but with the sustained lower frequency of someone who has absorbed a loss and is carrying it rather than being newly struck by it each time it rises. I thought about the amber light. I thought about the way she moved through the HAB in the morning before full wakefulness, careful and habitual, and how I had found that kind of movement deeply comforting for years, without knowing I found it comforting until the loss of it made the comfort retrospectively visible. I thought about the cup of recaf she had put on the table. In the common space of the accommodations section, during the permitted periods, I spoke occasionally with the other collected individuals from Scintilla and from other collection points who had been brought aboard at various stages of the ship's circuit. We were a diverse group in the ways that people assembled by the same institutional process are diverse, different ages and backgrounds and hive levels and worlds, with the commonality of the process itself as our shared framework. Some were young and afraid in the direct, visible way of youth. Some were older and had been carrying their awareness of what they were for years, having suppressed it or hidden it or simply not understood it, and their fear was different, more layered, mixed with the specific relief of no longer having to hold something in. There was a man named Tolm who had been a mid-hive clerk of some kind, precise and small, and with the bearing of someone who has spent a life making himself invisible. He had hidden his ability for 11 years, he told me, with the kind of flatness that comes from saying something you have never said before, and finding the words do not feel as large as you expected. His ability was minor and specific, a tendency for written documents to correct their own errors when he held them, a small and deeply useful power that he had attributed to careful proofreading. He had been turned in by a colleague after the colleague saw a misfiled form reorganize itself spontaneously on Tolm's desk. I said 11 years. He said, I was careful. I said, were you afraid the whole time? He said, yes, every day. He looked at me. Are you afraid now? I considered this with the same accuracy I had been applying to everything. No, I said, that is not what I am now. He said, what are you now? I said, I don't know yet. This was true. I was something in the process of becoming. The man who had walked into the Prometheum processing station on the morning of the valve incident and raised his hand was still technically continuous with the person sitting in the common space of a black ship in the warp, but the continuity was of the kind that connects the beginning of a very long journey to its middle, present but stretched thin. I was not the foreman. I was not the husband. I was not the citizen of Sump's Reach with the recaf habit and the 9-year shift routine. I was not yet whatever the telepathica's assignment process was going to make of me. I was in between, which was, I thought with a grim recognition, the most Sump's Reach thing I could possibly be. Always between. The assignment determination arrived at the end of the 3rd transit week, delivered in the same clear, precise, institutional way as every other communication I had received since my life had entered the Imperium's machinery. I was brought to one of the assessment rooms and given the determination document, which was 3 pages of reference numbers and classification codes and procedural notations, and at the end of it, a summary section that described in plain language what had been decided for me. I was assigned to an extended evaluation and training program, the document said, appropriate for individuals of my profile whose empathic component exceeded the telekinetic component by the margin I displayed. The program was conducted at the Telepathica's Regional Processing Center, the destination the ship was already traveling toward. The program would determine, over a period of approximately 2 years, whether I was best suited for astropathic training, for one of the intelligence service attachments, or for other appropriate roles within the Telepathica's broader operational structure. The soul binding was listed as a possible component of some of these pathways, but not all. 2 years, then a determination, then a life of some kind within the Imperium's psychic service structure, shaped by what I was, rather than by who I had been. I read the document twice. I signed the acknowledgement form at the back, which I did with my reference number rather than my name, because that was the signature format required, and I handed it back to the staff member waiting, and I was escorted back to the accommodations section. I sat in the compartment for a long time. I thought about Drevin Holt, shift foreman, 32 years old, 9 years at the burn, married to sailor, resident of Sump's Reach, man of no consequence, no ambition, no faith, beyond the next shift's quota. I thought about him with the objectivity of someone looking at a person from a sufficient distance to see the whole shape of the thing, rather than just the immediate surface. He had been, I thought, adequate. He had done the things required of him. He had managed his crew well enough. He had maintained his quota numbers. He had been faithful to Sella in the way of a man who takes seriously the things he has committed to. He had been, in the ways that the Imperium measures people who exist in the mid-hive without particular distinction, a functional citizen. He had filed his forms correctly. He had raised his hand. That was the thing that undid him, or rather, the thing that revealed that he had never been quite what he thought he was. The hand was not a choice. The thing that came out of him when the valve screamed was not something he had made, or cultivated, or invited. It was simply there, the way his blood type was simply there, written into him before he had any say in it, and it had waited with the patience of things that have no concept of time to make itself visible. He did not deserve what happened to him, in the sense that no one deserves to be the vessel of something they did not choose. He was not innocent of it, in the sense that the thing in him was real, and the Imperium of man's reasons for managing it, however brutal the management, were also real, were rooted in a genuine understanding of what uncontrolled psychic activity could mean in a universe where the warp was what the warp was, and the things in it were what they were. Both things could be true. I had been holding them in opposition for 4 weeks, and they kept being true simultaneously, and I was, finally, on a black ship in the warp with a reference number, instead of a name and an assignment determination that was going to shape whatever came next, learning to hold them both at once without needing them to resolve. The ship moved through the warp with the implacable patience of something that has made this journey countless times. The Geller field hummed in a register I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears, a constant reassuring pressure that said the boundary between what we were inside and what was outside was intact, was maintained, was held. The voices continued, ambient and various and strange, and I let them move through me because I was tired of managing the distance, and because the boundary I had been maintaining was my own internal one, and I was slowly, carefully, learning that it did not have to be absolute. I could feel without being consumed. That, I thought, was perhaps what the next 2 years were for. On the last night of the transit, I woke from the first sleep in weeks that had felt like sleep rather than like an interrupted performance of it, and I lay in the blue glow of the globe, and I felt the ship around me, the 60-something people in their compartments in the accommodations section, their presences varied and complicated, and genuinely human in the way of people who are afraid and tired, and beginning, slowly, to find their footing in a new reality. And beneath all of it, in the deep medium that I was only beginning to learn to read, that vast and ancient attending presence, not threatening, not comforting, not personal, real. I lay in the blue light, and I held the presence in awareness without reaching toward it, and without flinching from it, and it held me in the same way, and the equilibrium of it was not peace, but it was something in the same family of states, something that had a floor to it, a ground, even here, in the between. The ship arrived at the regional processing center at the beginning of the next cycle, and we were processed through the docking and intake procedures in the smooth, experienced way of an institution that has done this for centuries and knows exactly how to move people through the transition from one state of being to another, and I walked through the processing corridors with my reference number and my assignment determination and the plain institutional garments and nothing else, and I walked through because there was no other direction to walk. At the final checkpoint before the intake area for the training program, the staff member checking reference numbers looked up at me after confirming my entry in the system and said, in the brief window of human interaction between one institutional step and the next, first time through. It was not quite a question. I said, yes. She said, it gets less strange. I said, I believe you. She entered the confirmation in her system and waved me through. I went through. There was a hallway. At the end of the hallway there was another door. Beyond the door there would be more process, more assessment, more of the careful and methodical and completely indifferent machinery of the Imperium of man at work on the material that was now what I was. There would be 2 years of evaluation and training and gradual, deliberate reshaping of whatever Drevenholt had been into something useful and classified and operationally appropriate. There would be, possibly, a soul binding and the loss of light that came with it. There would be, certainly, a form of life I had not chosen and could not fully envision, and which bore no relationship to the life that had existed before the morning I raised my hand. I walked toward the door. I walked toward it with the compliance of a man who has been processed completely, who has had every available argument against compliance systematically removed over the course of weeks of institutional management, who has arrived at something that is not peace, and is not acceptance, and is not faith exactly, but which functions like all three, which is perhaps the most that the Imperium in its grinding and indifferent and oddly necessary way, ever actually produces in the people it processes. I walked toward the door with a reference number that was not yet a name. I walked toward it believing, on the deep level where conditioned belief lives, that this was where I was supposed to be. The system had worked. It had worked with precision and with patience and with the bureaucratic thoroughness of an institution that has been doing the same thing for 10,000 years and has long since optimized the process past any meaningful point of resistance. It had taken a man with a shift quota and a HAB unit and a woman who held him in the Emperor's light, and it had dissolved him into a reference number with a training assignment and a potential service pathway, and the dissolution had been so complete and so correctly applied that the dissolved man was walking through the door under his own power, voluntarily, having arrived at a place where voluntary and compelled were no longer meaningfully distinct. This is what the Imperium does to people like me. This is what the Imperium does to everyone, in slower or faster ways, by gentler or harder methods, with more or less awareness on the part of the person being done to. It works with what you are, and it applies to that material whatever process is appropriate for what the Imperium requires, and at the end of the process you are still there, technically, in the continuous sense of having a body and a reference number and a function, and the thing you used to be is still there in the past tense, held in the record of what was filed and stamped and officially documented. But you are through the door. And the door has closed. And somewhere in Sump's reach, in the amber light of a single lumen globe in a HAB unit where the lease has been transferred to sole tenancy, a woman sits at a table with both hands around a cup of recaf and thinks about a form she signed and the 2 lines she filled in at the bottom of it, the only personal thing in the entire document, the words she chose from all the words she had and put there in that small space. And on a ship somewhere between worlds, in a room with a blue globe and a reference number above the door, something that was a shift foreman is learning to hear, in the immense and indifferent medium of the warp's edge, the first faint shape of what it was always going to become. Not peace, not hope, not anything the litanies promise. Something older than any of those, something real.